educating our children and our grandchildren. And we've got two really great guests tonight on our call, and so I really want to just dive right into it. We've got some things happening in Texas that I know are happening in other states as well. Hopefully we can kind of talk it through tonight and clarify that there are connections with the federal legislation going through the process right now, the reauthorization of the ESEA/No Child Left Behind federal legislation, and then state legislation that's going through and mirroring from state to state. So we're gonna talk about that tonight. I'd like to introduce our two guests. Let's start out, and we will start with you. And this is Anita Hoge. She's been a wonderful guest. One of our most listened to archive calls was when you were on the show last time, Anita, and really kind of rocked our world when the information that you gave us on H.R. 5. So if you'll just reintroduce yourself, tell us a little bit about, for those folks who haven't heard you yet. So, Anita?
Okay. Thank you for asking me to be on tonight. I do have a background in education. I actually filed and won a federal complaint against the Pennsylvania Department of Ed for developing and researching the testing of attitudes, values, beliefs, and dispositions. The name of the test in Pennsylvania was a state assessment. It was called the EQA, Educational Quality Assessment. And to resolve my complaint, the state had to withdraw the test, which was testing the attitudes and values of our kids, and they issued a policy stating that they would never test attitudes again without getting informed written parental consent. We had revealed that this was an abusive and experimental program that was being used in every school in the state of Pennsylvania, and we found that we were actually the pilot for the national assessment, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, called the NAEP. So the test violated the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which is trying to be changed in all of the different pieces of legislation coming through, because the main aspect of No Child Left Behind, the reauthorization of ESA, is going to be the non-cognitive, or sometimes they call it the affective domain, which is the testing of attitudes, values, and dispositions of our children, which is a mental health agenda. We'll get into that later when I kind of pinpoint where in the legislation these things are. Basically, back in the 90s, and this is when I filed my complaint, we kind of turned the whole state and then the nation upside down at the time, because we were fighting outcome-based education, which was exactly the same as Common Core, except it was called OBE, outcome-based education. But they were trying to, again, bring in attitudes, values, and beliefs of children at that time. The difference between then and now is there was not legislation to mandate to the individual child, nor was the data systems and the data tracking up to date to monitor individuals in each state. That has all changed. The other thing what had happened during that time in the 90s, I was main researcher for the book Educating for the New World Order, which came out in 1991. I was a speaker. I'm a national speaker. I spoke at the Conservative Political Action Committee. I spoke at the Stanford University Conference on Computers, Freedom, and Privacy, in which I debated the executive director of the chief state school offices at the time, Barbara Clemens. I was an expert witness on against Hillary Care for the implementation of a mental health agenda through the nationalization of the healthcare system, which was in 1995. So basically, I've been involved in Supreme Court hearings on education, which we did win a Supreme Court case in Ohio. And also, I was expert witness for another case in Pittsburgh which was called the P-SWIM program, which certain school districts outside of Pittsburgh were actually used as a pilot in a school-wide program in Title I. So all of these things are like a background of information of what is coming forward today in new legislation that is being brought forward in the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. So I have been, writing articles and trying to get people to understand what it is that is being passed in this new legislation, what the difference is from when No Child Left Behind was passed and the difference of what the new ESA will mean. And a little bit of other information before we jump right into ESA is that 2.5 years ago, President Obama had changed the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act through an executive order, and that executive order was 12866. It was Obama's executive order. And what had happened at that time, which really made me very much more involved in education, was that FERPA was changed so that third-party contractors would be able to access personally identifiable information on your children without informed written parental consent. When that had happened, I was just amazed that that would have changed everything in education. It now would allow testing contractors, the PART, the Smarter Balance, the NAEP, all of these testing contractors would be able to access all of this information, your census data, anything connected with your children's education records would be up for grabs. Plus, they'd get this information for free. This is when I jumped back in, really began writing more and more about what was actually happening in. But what I had done in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania seems to be a pilot for everything going on these days, I had gone to Harrisburg with a group of parents, and I knew how to request the contracts from the state, which would be able to go into a written agreement with these third-party contractors to get the personally identifiable information. And it took a while to get this because one of our representatives did receive it, and then something happened. He wouldn't give us the information, and it was given to him on a flash drive. So there were tons and tons of contracts and information. So we had to go through another avenue, which we went through the Senate chairman of the Education Committee, and we did get the information. We also got it on a flash drive. But this is where I found out that Pennsylvania was a national model to create a national unique ID for every person in the United States. And each state could go to this particular website that I found to receive their contract of how the Department of Education, the National Center of Education Statistics, which is the department that monitors all education data and accountability, and another spin-off called the IES, Institute for Educational Research. No, I'm sorry, Institute for Educational Sciences, it's called IES. And these grants were astounding that we had received. It said that this whole entire data collection was going to collect birth through workplace. It was going to add wages. It was going to start when the child was born, would be given a unique ID to monitor all of the information. At that same time, when we got all of these contracts for the testing in our state, the graduation requirement test, the third grade guarantee, all of the information that we were getting, we realized that Pennsylvania, again, was moving toward the direction of testing attitudes and values. So on our website, there was a whole section on, they called it the SAS, Standards Aligned System portal in Pennsylvania, where they were summarizing something called the interpersonal skills. So when you look through this, and they called them that they were drafts, but it was all about the social, emotional, behavioral aspect of the child. So we had questioned this with the governor, and when we brought this to light, the governor immediately removed all the affective domain, those attitudes, values, and standards that were in the area of dispositions and personalities, and removed them from the website because we told them it was illegal and that they had to have informed written parental consent. So that's what brought us up to when the new reauthorization of ESA had come out at the same time. So we had H.R. 5 that had come out, where you had Representative or Congressman Klein had come out with this new reauthorization, and we also had Senator Alexander had come out with the Senate version of No Child Left Behind. Senator Alexander never put a number on his bill, so we keep referring to it as Alexander's ESA reauthorization. There was, of course, a huge debate, particularly after this radio show. There was huge contacts in Congress stating that we did not want this to go forward. And the reasons we didn't want this to go forward were massive. Not only was there multiple areas where the legislation stated that it was going to go into the social, emotional, behavioral aspect of children, which would make the affective domain legal, if that's even possible. You know, you'll have to ask the question, can we score the attitudes and values of our children in the United States? We are a pluralistic society. Can government create a standard for your values? Can they create a standard for your values or what you teach your children, your beliefs? So this is where the key is. Number one, if you ask that question, well, how do you score it? How are we collecting this information? And this is mental health. Okay, you realize this is the personality of your children. That's an invasion of privacy. Okay, so when the government decides they're going to collect all of this information on your children, on your families, of what you have taught your children, that's a violation of privacy. But the second part to this is if you're going to score the values of your children, if you're going to remediate, if you're going to have a standard and then you say you're going to have interventions in the personality of my children to some sort of government standard, that's a violation of your freedom. That's a major civil rights violation. So understanding where this direction is going, this is exactly the same agenda. When I testified against Hillary Care back in 1995, and I testified in front of the Department of Interior National Infrastructure, Health, and Education Data Security hearings, and I had presented my paper exposing the medicalization of schools. And what this meant was that the schools were going to be set up to do mental health wraparound services where the children would be identified for personality traits that did not meet a proficiency level. Who was going to create this proficiency level for personality traits? Who was going to create the scoring for how you would score these criteria? So going back to that area where I said it was interpersonal skills in Pennsylvania, what we found was the original criteria had begun with the Department of Labor. And that was issued in 1992, where they came out in writing at least, because there were quite a few conferences and papers that were written beforehand. But in 1992, the Department of Labor came out with a document called the SCANs, the Secretary's Commission for Chief